News, World News Sunday. Here's Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. President Bush arrived in Brussels today for this week's NATO summit meeting, prepared to take on an opponent who isn't even there. When the leaders of the 16-nation North Atlantic Treaty Organization sit down together tomorrow morning, they will be divided as never before because of the arms control initiatives of Soviet President Gorbachev. And though Gorbachev won't be present, Britt Hume reports that Mr. Bush intends to hit him with a counterpunch.
40 years after the founding of the U.S.-led NATO alliance, President Bush arrived for this summit facing a stiff challenge to his leadership and to the strategic concepts he believes have brought
in the longest period of peace and freedom that Europe has known in the modern age.
The president is expected to ask the alliance tomorrow to propose a reduction in U.S. troop strength in Europe as part of a NATO offer in the conventional arms talks with the Soviets. The idea is to recapture the peace initiative from Soviet leader Gorbachev and to overshadow the administration's dispute with West German Chancellor Kohl. He wants to make a deal with the Soviets now to eliminate short-range nuclear missiles from Europe. On This Week with David Brinkley today, the president's national security advisor was adamant against that because of the Soviet advantage in conventional forces.
It doesn't make any sense to start talking about reduction, much less elimination of those systems, as long as there is this conventional imbalance.
But West German Defense Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher was just as adamant in a speech today about reducing short-range missiles now.
Keine Waffenart.
No weapons category, he told applauding supporters, should be excluded from disarmament talks. Earlier, as part of his observance of Memorial Day, Mr. Bush ordered his helicopter to make an unscheduled landing on the USS Guadalcanal, anchored off the Italian coast. He spent about 15 minutes with the surprised crew. Mr. Bush had just taken part in a ceremony honoring the thousands of U.S. war dead buried at the military cemetery at Nettuno, near where the Allied invasion of Italy began 45 years ago. Part of the president's problem with NATO is a Europe where many are too young to remember that war.
It might be difficult for them to understand why we need to keep a strong military deterrent to prevent war. The answer is here, among the quiet of the graves.
The leaders of NATO, of course, have not forgotten the American sacrifices in World War II and in holding off the Soviet threat that followed. But as their constituents keep telling them, that was then, this is now. Britt Hume, ABC News, Brussels.
This may be now, but as National Security Advisor Scowcroft suggests, President Bush's point will be that a serious unfavorable military imbalance between East and West still exists. However, as Barry Dunsmore reports, the counterpoint from some West Europeans is that even if the imbalance is still there, the Soviets' will to use it isn't.
It was probably a public relations ploy, but they really did start to take the Iron Curtain down between Hungary and Austria earlier this month. And it was surely for show, but they actually did start taking Soviet tanks and troops out of Eastern Europe in recent weeks. Meantime, NATO forces were holding exercises where they were theoretically destroying most of Central Europe with short-range and tactical nuclear weapons. After 40 years, it's no longer quite so clear to the average European which side is wearing the white hats. In the view of the vast majority of Western Europeans, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has traveled the world making major arms control concessions, while President Bush, until now, has seemed unwilling or unable to make suitably major counteroffers.
Mr. Gorbachev made a number of proposals without, so far, having been given adequate answers by the West.
When NATO was formed 40 years ago, there was no such confusion. Soviet forces posed a real and present danger to Western Europe. A despotic Joseph Stalin, having killed millions of his own people to achieve power, seemed quite capable of killing millions of his enemies in the West. Containing Stalin and communism was what the Cold War was all about. But 40 years later, even NATO's top military commander concedes the Cold War is effectively over.
The West has won the Cold War. I think we ought not to try to crow about it. What we ought to realize is that we are now moving, as we have not moved in 40 years, toward a better position with the Soviet Union.
It sometimes sounds as though these old Lance missiles in West Germany are the critical issue in NATO. whether to modernize them as the U.S. and Britain want, or to negotiate them away as the Germans would prefer. But short-range nukes are by no means the real issue.
If you want to keep the German nation fully inside the Western Alliance's camp, negotiate with Mr. Gorbachev.
The message Mr. Bush will hear repeatedly this week is that the Soviets are no longer an imminent threat, and that it's time for the U.S. to show that it does not need the Cold War in order to have a foreign policy. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, Brussels.
Peter Jennings is in Brussels to watch how all this comes out, and we'll have a full report tomorrow on World News Tonight. Incidentally, there were a couple more incidents from President Bush's day worth mentioning. In Italy this morning, about 40 neo-Nazi demonstrators held up the president's motorcade for about 5 minutes by forming a human pyramid on the road. Police broke it up. And when the Bushes made their surprise visit to the helicopter carrier Guadalcanal, one sailor, just out of a shower, came face-to-face with the president and first lady clad only in a towel. The Associated Press reports with a straight face that the embarrassed seaman was the only man aboard who didn't seek a presidential handshake.
World News Sunday.